Hello, hello, hello. Is it on? Are we on? No? Are we on now? No? Hello? Yes? Is my mic on? Does it sound like my mic's on? Yeah, it's working? Well, hello everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I'm feeling quite chuffed with myself at the moment because I think we've got a bigger crowd here than Stephen McGann. So that's something to tell my mum later on. So my name's Robin Carhart-Harris. I head the Psychedelic Research Group at Imperial. You can see our logo there alongside the charity that I'm launching later this year. Credit to Imperial for allowing us to have a psychedelic research group. Science should be apolitical. Perhaps some of your views may have been shaped by in some sense, stories that you've heard that perhaps have been influenced in a political way. So I would ask you just to listen throughout this talk in an open-minded way. Try to follow the science. I've tried to distill it down to a digestible level. The talk that I'll give is scripted, so sorry for that, but I'll try to expand on it. It allows me to keep to time a little better. And then that should give us plenty of opportunity for interaction. I'll take some questions. If there's desire for it, I can also go more into detail about how these fascinating compounds work in the brain. But with the talk that I have, I'm going to focus on psychedelics for mental health. So here we go. So mental illness is the most burdensome of all the major categories of illness. It's also estimated to be the most costly. It affects at least 1 in 4 adults in the UK, costs the UK economy an estimated £100 billion every year, and is the leading cause of life years lost to disease. And despite the immensity of this problem, and it truly is immense, mental health research receives only about 5%, only 5% of the total annual UK health research spending, so really not enough at all. And it has to be said that despite a steady increase in the severity of the burden of mental illness, psychiatry's performance in terms of improving its ability to treat mental illness hasn't been good enough. Prescription rates of psychiatric medications increase year on year at record levels. But this does not appear to be solving the problem. It doesn't appear to be chipping into the prevalence. And leading the way in terms of burden is depression. It's the #1 burden of disease in Europe and a leading cause of lost work productivity, which is where much of the cost of mental illness comes in. It's also associated, tragically, with several thousand suicides every year in the UK. Many suicide victims are young people, adding to the tragedy. Young men especially. Suicide's now the leading cause of premature death among men under the age of 45 in the UK. And 12 men take their own life every day in the UK. Every day, 12. Perhaps due to stigma and shame, many people suffering from mental illness go untreated. The treatment gap is greater in mental illness than for any other sector of healthcare. Yet, almost all of those who do receive public health care for mental illness do so via medications prescribed to them by their doctors. About 90% who come to their doctors, they'll be prescribed some psychiatric medication. Antidepressant prescription rates specifically have more than doubled in this country in the last decade. About 65 million prescriptions were issued in England in 2016. And the leading medications for depression, you've probably heard of them. They're the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs. These are drugs like Prozac, Celexa, citalopram, Lexapro. And contrary to what's been reported in the past, these drugs do something. They're not mere placebos. What do? They block the removal of an important chemical messenger, a neurotransmitter in the brain, serotonin, allowing its levels to slowly accumulate. Yet quite how SSRIs work isn't fully understood. We know some things. One of the things that we suspect is that the moderation of stress and likely emotion as well seems to be a key component of their therapeutic mechanism. And when this is combined with the right level of psychosocial support, which seems to be critical, an SSRI-treated individual may find it easier to cope. But is coping enough? Whether SSRIs are sufficiently effective is a complex question. A recent meta-analysis has shown that treatment with SSRIs is associated with a greater decrease in depressive symptoms than treatment with placebo. So in some respects, they seem to work. But response, and this is critical, is still incomplete in at least half of people treated with their first SSRI. So are they good enough? They often take weeks to work, are associated with a range of different side effects, and aren't easy to come off. SSRIs also appear to have an ambiguous effect on suicidality, being no better than placebo at decreasing suicidality. And this isn't something that you would naturally expect from an effective antidepressant. So how can we do better than this? The typical place people turn to when considering this question naturally is psychotherapy, and I understand that. However, psychotherapy, and this is critical, isn't readily available within our current overstretched public healthcare system. Waiting lists are very long, and conventional therapies such as cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT can often feel superficial to patients and as if it's not getting to the root of their problem. It's often 6 sessions and it just doesn't seem to go deep enough, and when it does, it's towards the end of those sessions, and patients can feel, in some respects, not properly heard, not thoroughly heard. Added to this, conventional psychotherapies appear to be no more effective than SSRIs, and crucially, are more resource demanding. It's expensive. People's time is expensive, and it's really this that's the major reason why medications dominate the current system. But something's going on. Psychiatry is currently undergoing a quiet revolution. Entrepreneurs have begun investing several millions of dollars into a large multi-site trial across Europe and now the US and Canada, encompassing over 10 countries, over 400 patients. It's informed and guided by the advice of the major medicines regulators of Europe, the EMA, and the US, the FDA, as well as significant thought leaders in psychiatry, including the former head of the European Psychiatric Association, former head of psychiatry at Oxford, Guy Goodwin, also the former head of the American Psychiatric Association, Paul Summergrad, and also Tom Insall, the former head for many years of the US National Institute of Mental Health. So major players in psychiatry are jumping on board with this thing. And what is it? What is the trial that I'm talking about? It's to test the safety and efficacy of psilocybin therapy for treatment-resistant depression. What is psilocybin? It's a naturally occurring psychedelic compound found in so-called magic mushrooms. The psychedelic revolution in mental health care may well be coming. I can see it, and I'll try and convince you to see it as well. That psilocybin has healing potential isn't new news for some indigenous cultures of this world, who, records suggest, have been using psilocybin-containing mushrooms for millennia. Not something that you could say about SSRIs, of course. Discovered by modern science in 1958, psilocybin enjoyed a brief dalliance, less than 10 years, with mainstream psychiatry, before political interference, which I touched upon at the start, effectively quashed its research before any firm conclusions could be drawn about it. Human research with psychedelics was revived in first Switzerland and Germany, and then in the US in the mid to late 1990s, so not long ago. And the first modern clinical trial with psilocybin was conducted in the US in 2006. This was a trial assessing psilocybin for obsessive-compulsive disorder, showing quite promising outcomes there in a small trial. Also in 2006, a remarkable paper was published by a team at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. They reported a double-blind study in which the effects of a single high dose of psilocybin were compared with those of methylphenidate or Ritalin, a drug for ADHD. The scientists found that psilocybin induced profound, transformative experiences in most of the volunteers. Remarkably, over half of them rated their psilocybin experience as being among the most meaningful of the whole of their lives. This is an experience that lasted about 4 or 5 hours, yet they put it up there in the top 5 with things like the birth of their first child. So something major had happened, and they didn't see this kind of thing with the control compound, Ritalin. The team also found evidence of long-term improvements in psychological well-being that were evident over 1 year on from the participants' single experience with psilocybin. They'd never had a psychedelic experience in their life. They had one experience over a year on. They're reporting persistent improvements in their psychological well-being, which they're attributing to their experience. What about myself? Well, I began my own research with psilocybin towards the end of my PhD in psychopharmacology. So this is coming into 2008. I conducted a series of brain imaging studies using the likes of fMRI, MEG, looking at how these drugs work in the brain. And what we found really was a crucial part of motivating a grant application to the Medical Research Council in the UK. And this supported a clinical trial, a small clinical trial. It was very hard to get the permissions for, but we managed it. It took a while. And what was this trial doing? It was assessing the safety and efficacy of psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. It was the first trial of its sort. The sample in the trial comprised of mostly severely depressed patients. They tried, on average, 4 to 5 different antidepressants without response, and some as many as 11. The average duration of the patient's depression was 17 years. And remarkably, all of them showed some level of decrease in their depressive symptoms at 1 week. Half were in remission, meaning essentially they're depression-free at 3 weeks, and significant effects remained at 6 and now 12 months. Subsequent larger placebo-controlled studies have found similar effects with psychedelics. They've looked at the likes of end-of-life anxiety and depression. Others have found positive outcomes with psilocybin for alcohol dependence and tobacco addiction. Let me just, for a moment, focus on tobacco addiction. 80% abstinence rates over 6 months on from 2 treatment sessions with psilocybin. Those are the kind of treatment effects that are unheard of in the literature on treating tobacco addiction. 80% abstinence. Also MDMA, which is a quasi-psychedelic, when this is used in 2 or 3 therapy sessions, psychotherapy sessions, it's showing significant promise for treating post-traumatic stress disorder. And interestingly, it recently achieved breakthrough therapy status with the FDA in the US, so this seems to have legs as well. Now, this is so important. A common principle in all of this work is that the therapeutic effect of psychedelics is highly dependent on the context in which they are taken. Take out the context, and you may well not have a therapeutic treatment model. You could even have something that's harmful. So the context is essential. And the context is essential both with regards to what the patient brings to the experience, so in kind of inner context, in terms of their pre-existing personality, memories, expectations, intentions, their mood at the time, as well as what is outside of them, their environment. So this can include things like their relationship with those guiding the experience, and also other environmental factors such as the music that's listened to. All of the modern trials with psychedelics have used music within their sessions. Music has also been a staple component of the psychedelic experience since ancient times. We've also found that its effect on people during the psychedelic experience is significantly predictive of the nature of the experience that they have, which is in turn highly predictive of the longer-term therapeutic outcomes. So this treatment model, the psychedelic treatment model, is radically different to conventional treatment models in psychiatry, which usually involve a chronic medication strategy. You're given a drug and you take it every day. This is something very different, radically different. It's neither just a drug treatment, but neither is it just pure psychotherapy. It's rather a synergistic combination of both of these things. The drug induces a state of high plasticity through a particular action on the brain's serotonin system. Perhaps I could tell you about that in a moment, which when combined with a particular therapeutic process enables the natural dismantling of defensive beliefs and behaviors, resetting the mind in a healthier way. Psilocybin has a low toxicity, a very low toxicity, much lower than alcohol and ketamine, for example, ketamine being explored now for depression. It's rapid acting, but its effects are also enduring, which can't be said about ketamine. Its antidepressant effects are short-lived, with people reporting benefits days, weeks, months, sometimes years well after the drug has left the body. Unlike other drugs of potential misuse, including several legal ones, psilocybin is also not habit-forming, meaning people do not get addicted to it. If anything, it seems to be anti-addiction. Also, unlike other drugs, population studies, and this is a very challenging finding, population studies sampling a broad swathe of, in this case, the US population, these studies suggest that psychedelic use among the general population is actually associated with positive rather than negative mental health outcomes. So again, something that really challenged the stigma around these compounds. So what are these mental health outcomes? So significantly lower rates of suicidality and also psychological distress. And this is an anomaly. You don't see this with other potential drugs of misuse. Whatever we pick, alcohol, cannabis, heroin, the more you take, the worse your mental health, but that's not the case with psychedelics. Rather, it's the inverse. So how do they work? I've touched on things like context, but what else is there? Psychedelics have shown promise for a range of different disorders. It's early days, these are small trials, yet the potential seems to be broad. So this is intriguing, and it may suggest that they target something that's common to different psychiatric disorders. And what might this be? And does perhaps it hint at some kind of unifying model of mental illness? Many people in our trial described feeling disconnected during their illness. They also said that their experiences with conventional care did little to help with this sense of being alone and apart from things. Being prescribed SSRIs sometimes felt like a palm off, and CBT sometimes felt patronizing, according to our patients. Treatment with psilocybin, on the other hand, was described as feeling fundamentally reconnecting in a personal sense, in terms of a reconnection to emotions, senses, including the body as a whole, but also interpersonally, in terms of feeling more connected to other people, whether they be loved ones or strangers. And finally, participants also described a transpersonal connection in which they felt connected to a vast universal order, something much larger than them as individuals. Relatedly, they also described feeling closer to and more appreciative of nature. There's now compelling evidence to suggest that the nature of the experiences people have under a psychedelic mediate the longer-term psychological outcomes. The experiences seem to be key. So what kind of experiences are important? We have new evidence that an emotional release or breakthrough may be a critical factor. We've also found that a sense of personal insight or psychological insight more broadly, or clarity during the experience and afterwards, is predictive of better outcomes. And finally, a collapse of self-boundaries and a parallel oceanic feeling of oneness also seems to be key. It's the essence of what some people call a peak experience and others spiritual or mystical. Like in infancy, psychedelics appear to work by collapsing our beliefs and assumptions, wiping away our prejudices and biases so that we may go wide-eyed again into this complex and unpredictable world with a renewed openness and willingness to experience and learn. In the words of Isaac Asimov, your assumptions are your windows on the world. Scrub them off every once in a while, or the light won't come in. So very briefly, I mentioned at the start that we're launching a charity. It's later on this year. Why are we doing it? What's it about? It's run by scientists at the leading edge of this research area. It intends to tackle some of the elitism and individualism of science by democratically involving those who support us in our planning and decision-making through polls and such like. We hope to publish as a collective rather than as individuals. We're committed to principles of open science, such as open access and data sharing. We'll focus on the therapeutic potential of naturally occurring psychedelic compounds. The campaign will launch on the 20th of September. It will focus on a new study using innovative technology to collect data from the ceremonial use of psychedelics outside in the world, hence global, outside of our lab, so naturalistic data collection, but prospective. We also want to combine EEG with recordings in ceremonial contexts. So that's our ambitious aim. So I think at this stage, I'd like to thank you for your attention. We'll take some questions, and then perhaps I could tell you about how these, in a bit more detail, how these compounds work in the brain, how we think they work in the brain. So thank you very much. We've got a decent bit of time. I think we're going to run till 2:10. So we'll do some questions, and then I'll try and do a bit of hardcore neuroscience for you. I'll take a question there. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. I'm really interested in the sort of potential savings to the NHS as a result of psilocybin and other psychedelics. Have you considered how you're going to disseminate the findings so that you can affect the mainstream?
Yeah.
This sort of quality of outcome shouldn't be confined to research and research institutes. It needs to be embedded throughout modern medicine, so
Yeah.
have you thought about how that might happen?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about it. Yeah, I mean, we're in this really interesting position at the moment where that dissemination is happening. People are naturally, as is evident by, I guess, the number of people who've turned up, are interested in this topic, and they're getting a sense that there's something here that's worth listening to. And so the disseminations, it's quite easy to disseminate, but the key thing, especially in this age, is to try and disseminate information that's accurate and that doesn't bias either way, because it's very easy to go both ways, to romanticize, but also to sort of be alarmist in the message around these compounds. And that's dominated for so long, the alarmist message. Now we need to be mindful that a kind of evangelism, if you want, doesn't also bias. So when I emphasize things like context, that's critical. You know, this isn't saying to people, look, you can take some magic mushrooms and you'll cure your depression. It's saying we have a treatment model. In a lab, we do certain things. We have people lying in a bed with mental health professionals. They listen to music. We're open and we listen to you. And so in terms of the question of how we can integrate this realistically in terms of public healthcare, because private healthcare could be quite easy, but public healthcare is a different matter because of the cost. You know, so the key question there is, can we deliver a kind of psychotherapy? Because I think fundamentally that is what this is. It's a drug-assisted psychotherapy, but the psychotherapy is bottom line. And can we deliver that in a way that it's an accelerated psychotherapy? You know, and if the outcomes are enduring, then maybe there's an edge there over, and the effectiveness is perhaps superior to psychotherapy on its own, something that we intend to test in the future, then maybe we've got something that is more cost-effective than conventional psychotherapies. In terms of drugs are cheap. You know, SSRIs dominate because they're cheap and they work a bit, but there are other issues there. So could this rival SSRIs? Well, one way that it could is if people want it, if the demand's there, they think and they hear from others that this is somehow a more holistic treatment, that when they go to the treatment center and they have their 3 or 4 sessions, they're really listened to and it goes deep and they're left with something profound afterwards. And so that could be part of it. And also the cost effectiveness calculation should also take into account cost saving. So if you have this abridged treatment model and you're well for a prolonged period, then that's saving costs, and maybe you get back to work and you're productive at work. So this is the optimistic view, but I think there are reasons to be optimistic, and let's see how it all plays out. Sure, I'll take a question now. Are you ready or not? I saw a hand go up. But
I'd love to hear more about how the kind of synesthetic experience and the DMN. I've heard things about those areas activating.
yeah,
How that causes
yeah.
this kind of inspiring lesson.
Yeah, sure. Shall I do that when I go on to the... I'll show you a few slides and I'll walk you through some of the brain stuff. I saw another hand over there, sure. So this is where psychedelics are different, I think, to the kind of drugs that you might be thinking of that have dominated psychiatry. I don't really think psychedelics are drugs that allow you to cope better and accept your lot and your situation. If anything, they might lead you to challenge your situation. And that may be one of the reasons why they were politicized even. And this is something that we've tested recently by measuring things like political perspective in relation to psychedelic use. And we've seen that it moves in an intriguing way. In that, for example, liberalism seems to increase significantly after psychedelic use, albeit in a small sample in the study I'm citing. But we've also looked at surveys and found the same relationship. But also authoritarianism drops. So that wouldn't really fit this idea that you're given a medication that allows you to accept your lot and stay at work when maybe you should be quitting a dead-end job. You know, it's more likely, and there's that famous quote, dangerous quote from Timothy Leary about tuning in and dropping out. The dropping out bit wasn't a great message, I think, and kind of stoked some of the worries about psychedelics fueling the counterculture. You know, but this is where things like integration, not just being a kind of rebel without a cause, but just, you know, a questioning mind is I think, a healthier mind. But I talked about liberalism and authoritarianism. Authoritarianism dropping, liberalism going up. Something else I think is harder to argue against, whatever your political perspective, unless perhaps you're Donald Trump, is that we saw nature relatedness or nature connectedness also increasing after psychedelics. And, you know, given where we are at the moment in terms of climate change and such like, how could you argue against people feeling closer to and more appreciative of nature? I'll take one more question and then we'll do some neuroscience stuff. At the back, because I've been favoring the front. Right at the back, the guy who's still got his hand up, if that's all right. Sure. All right. Yeah, we are microdosing. So we are going to test microdosing with LSD. We're going to do it. We're doing it already via surveys. People who intend to microdose, we ask them to give us some data before they start, and then we track them throughout. And so we're looking at it that way, and we're also doing a controlled trial with the Beckley Foundation, one of our major collaborators, to test that. I've realized I've taken questions from all men, haven't I? So I should take one from a woman. Sorry. Yeah, Big Pharma's reaction is one of observation at the moment. Observation with the sniper rifle, perhaps. But I don't know how it will play out. You know, if this seems to work, then they might start to really take it seriously. At the moment, we're in a position with lots of small trials. The big trials are coming. The investment is there. It's philanthropists. bit of that, mostly entrepreneurs who are actually looking for a return here that are now investing. And big pharma, some of their staff are actually joining, but whether they'll really start to put in their money, I'm not sure yet. They're not doing it yet, but if this works, maybe they'll come in and steamroll and take it over. Let's just hope they do it right if they do that. Yeah, I mean, ketamine, they're now, Janssen has been investing heavily in ketamine for treatment-resistant depression. So, there's a murky history, of course, with industry and mental health, but at the end of the day, doctors and patients want something that works, and that can change opinions in the market and drive things on. Shall I do a bit of the brain stuff? Yeah, we've got about 10 minutes. So let's start with the basics. What are psychedelics? I didn't really address that. I'll focus on what's called the classic psychedelics. So these are compounds like psilocybin, which is actually a prodrug. It gets in the body, it's metabolized, it becomes psilocin. This is really the drug that's pharmacologically active, so to speak. Dimethyltryptamine, DMT, a very potent psychedelic that people smoke and then transition into this weird other world, and they'll say it's the weirdest experience of the whole of their lives. It's also something that you'll find in an Amazonian brew tea called ayahuasca, which people sometimes travel to the Amazon to have, but it's been used indigenously for likely millennia. And also LSD is the prototypical psychedelic, prototypical because it was only after it was discovered. Its main psychedelic effects were formally discovered in 1943 by Albert Hofmann, and the term psychedelic was coined just over 10 years afterwards. So in that sense, you could consider it the prototypical psychedelic. These are all compounds that work on the serotonin system. They work on the serotonin system in a particular way. They hijack it. They pretend to be serotonin. They come in, they work on aspects of the serotonin system that modulate brain function. And the serotonin system is the most complex neurotransmitter, neuromodulator in the brain, I would argue. It has some 14 or so different receptors. They often do different things, quite different things, if not opposite things to each other. The one that psychedelics seem to work via, most critically, is the serotonin 2A receptor. This is a curious receptor because humans have loads of it, and it's concentrated mostly in the cortex, which humans have loads of. It's what sets us apart from other animals, really. All the convoluted stuff in our brains. The subcortical regions, you can just about make it out, a blue in these images on the left. That's where the serotonin 2A receptors are low. This is a heat map that's showing where those 2A receptors are. Another thing to say is that they're most densely expressed in the high-level aspects of our brains. You mentioned the default mode network. This is a network that's captivated human neuroscience because people have speculated it's kind of the substrate of the self. There are reasons to think that it might be associated with self-consciousness, self-reflection, introspection, imagination, some psychological functions that are maybe specific to our species. So this 2A receptor seems to be key. I'll try and do this quite breezily because we don't have too long. And what does it do? It seems to induce a generalized plasticity both in the brain and the mind. You could call that a functional plasticity, a kind of hot state that an organized brain would go into, then be supple, and then return to an organized state afterwards. Now, this 2A receptor, remember that's the key receptor, the serotonin 2A receptor that mediates how psychedelics work. What we also know about this receptor is it has very important interactions with environmental variables. And so, for example, in an enriched environment, you might be influenced more via the 2A receptor. And these are all different findings that support this principle. Essentially, it's saying, yeah, that the 2A receptor stimulation, which is what psychedelics do, tunes up our sensitivity to environment. You'll remember in my talk I talked about that, the essential importance of context. So this is the mechanism by which it's happening. Let's look at the brain in young people and older people. There's a 21-year-old's brain, a heat map there where we've labeled where these 2A receptors are. You can see that there's loads of them in the young brain on the left, and in a 68-year-old brain, they've gone away. So that might speak to some of the plasticity of youth, that learning is especially intense when we're young. Also, a curious thing is that stress and environmental volatility, which often drives stress, seems, again, to tune up serotonin to A receptor functioning. So this might hint at why and what psychedelics are hijacking in terms of brain function. Maybe they're hijacking an aspect of our brains that's naturally there already for change. I'm focusing here on something that I call the entropic brain. And entropy is a measure of our uncertainty about a system. The more unpredictable a system, the more uncertain we are about its behavior. You can do formal measures of brain unpredictability or complexity or entropy. Here you'll see an image where people have done that with waking, with deep sleep, NREM sleep, that's non-REM sleep, or in a way, non-dream sleep, broadly speaking. And then REM sleep, which is where the stage of sleep where you have your most vivid dreams. You can see that bar chart, that's entropy or complexity being maximal during waking. It drops down during deep sleep, and it comes back up during dream sleep, REM sleep. Now, something that we found recently, here it is that psychedelics appear to change the brain in terms of its complexity or its entropy in a unique way. To my knowledge, no one else has ever found this with another state of consciousness, possibly with epilepsy, but that's unclear. But if you go the other way, there's a ton of things that will drop complexity or entropy in the brain, like sedatives, anesthetics, sleep itself, as is shown there, and also brain injury, disorders of consciousness or illness. They'll drop the complexity of brain activity. Psychedelics appear to tune it in the other direction, increasing brain complexity. So this is curious. Another thing to consider is how this way of understanding how psychedelics work meshes with arguably the dominant model of how the brain works, the so-called Bayesian brain model, which is that we sample the world in such a way that we generally interpret it and predict it. And our experience of the world is highly influenced by our predictions. You'll see the classic sort of optical illusion triangle there, where there is no white triangle in the middle, yet we all see it. That's because of our predictions, and it's a kind of hint about how our brains work. So what psychedelics might do when they induce this hot state, this state of plasticity, is that they might relax our assumptions. They might collapse our assumptions so that they may change. So there's a window of opportunity for change, and really that ties in with the therapeutic model. The change happens via these 2A receptors. Relaxing of beliefs might be the kind of thing that's going on that can account for things like the political changes I was talking about. You know, how can you change your beliefs if they become ossified? Well, a hot state might be the kind of thing that can do it. You know, other natural contexts that might induce a similar kind of thing, there aren't many, but people do have transformative experiences. They often have them during periods of intense stress and crisis. And so again, this kind of this fundamental change mechanism in the brain seems to be what psychedelics are hijacking. It's 2:10. I just want to tell you briefly about criticality. Criticality is something that characterizes nature. There's a book called How Nature Works that it was a seminal book in the sort of scientific history of criticality. What is criticality? It's a point, or more accurately, it seems now, a zone in between a system in nature being either entirely ordered and so stuck and frozen with no dynamics, to being entirely chaotic with no form because it's just like a gas, just entirely chaotic. But there's a sweet spot, a Goldilocks zone in between these two extremes, which is what much of living nature exhibits. It sits in this sweet spot, and then it shows certain properties like maximal sensitivity to perturbation or just sort of being affected, but while preserving order. Also things like fractality. Might be able to make out that fractal patterns in the background here. And it's something that the brain exhibits, but curiously, we found that psychedelics tune this phenomenon up in a positive direction. So they'll increase signatures, characteristics of criticality, which is a very curious thing. And this is speculative. It's quite loose, but you know, psychedelics don't work via magic. They work on this thing of nature, our brains, in our heads. And so what are they doing? And just this idea and now this finding, we've recently found that psychedelics tune up criticality, may account for some of these very profound experiences where people report feeling a sense of oneness, a connection with nature. It's an interesting idea, I think, to explore what accounts for that sense of reconnection or harmony. And to many extents, that's what criticality is about. It's about a kind of harmony. I'll end by telling you about, there's a kind of wacky theory that popped up in the 70s, I think it was, by a kind of commentator, really, I think. I don't quite know what he was academically, but he was a brilliant speaker, a chap called Terence McKenna. He had this theory that human consciousness itself had been catalyzed by the use of psychedelic drugs, that primitive man or apes had come across psilocybin-containing mushrooms, they'd ingested them, and somehow that led to cortical growth and cognitive enhancement. And you know, scientists don't have much time for that idea, but there's something kind of curious in it. What I'd like to entertain is the idea that if this system that psychedelics hijack is there in our brains anyway, what's it there for? There's evidence that environmental volatility tunes up this system. Maybe environmental volatility did drive accelerated learning through evolution. We've got so many of these receptors that psychedelics work on. So, you know, maybe these receptors, maybe the serotonin system and the serotonin 2A system has played a critical role in the development of our minds by tuning up our ability to learn and adapt, something which does set us apart as a species. Through our evolution. Just a thought to leave you with on a Saturday afternoon before you go and have a pint of beer. Our next trial is going to go head-to-head with SSRIs, actually. People will either get 6 weeks of escitalopram, a leading SSRI, or 2 sessions with psilocybin. So, you know, we want to put our money where our mouth is, so to speak, and really give this a proper test. So thank you, everyone, for your attention. Hopefully that was interesting.